Turn your Bibles to the book of Galatians chapter 4. Galatians chapter 4. Continuing our study in this book, Paul is writing to the churches of Galatia who are being troubled by the Judaizing teachers wanting to bind the law of Moses upon Gentile converts. So that's the fundamental issue at stake here. That's what he's addressing. And I think we left off, or maybe in this vicinity, somewhere around verse 8, and Paul is talking to the Christians there. He says, "But then indeed," verse 8, "when you did not know God, you served by nature, you serve those who by nature are not gods. But now after you have known God, or rather are known by God, how is it that you turn again to the weak and beggarly elements, to which you desire again to be in bondage? You observe days and months and seasons and years, and I'm afraid for you, lest I have labored for you in vain." So he talks about their past history in verse 8. And this is true of both Jew and Gentile. You didn't know God at one time, didn't know him in the sense of having a relationship with him, but you serve those which by nature, by their makeup, are not gods. And so he's talking about the idols. We know the Gentiles served the idols, but we sometimes forget the Jews did too. A lot of times went back and served idols. And so that's your past. Your past has been in rebellion against God. But now, in verse 9, there's still a problem. Because you know God, you've come to know him, you've become Christians, and you're known by him, so he knows you, but why are you turning back? You turn again, that's the idea of going back again. Turn again to the weak and beggarly elements to which you desire to be in bondage. Now these weak and beggarly elements refer to the law of Moses, as we'll see in just a second, but it connects in with verse 3. When we were children, we were in bondage under the elements of the world. So the weak and beggarly elements of verse 9, the same thing, talking about the law of Moses. And verse 11 confirms, you observe days and months and seasons and years. These are the holidays of the Jewish law. And so not only were they binding circumcision, but they were also trying to bind some of these holidays. So the days such as the Sabbath day, which come around every week, every Saturday. The months, like they had a new moon celebration that's mentioned in the Old Testament. The seasons and years, you had these yearly Passover, Pentecost type things, Feast of Harvest and things like that. And they're going back and observing those days. They're being bound upon the Gentile converts. And so Paul says, as a result of this, verse 11, I'm afraid for you. I'm afraid for your souls. You're headed in the wrong direction. You can't be bound to Moses and Christ at the same time. You got to pick a side. And if you're going to go be with Moses, you're going to be lost. That's not going to work. So I'm afraid for you, lest I've labored over you in vain. All the preaching I've done, all the teaching I've done is going to be for nothing if you don't repent of this and come back out of this and start serving the Lord the way you're supposed to. I think that we talked about that last week. Any questions, comments on that section right there?
This day and time, does still some of the Jews still do these?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the Jews of this day and time, they still observe their Sabbath day. They still observe the Pentecost and things like that. They don't observe some of those things in the way the Bible outlines because they can't. The temple is not there, so they can't offer the sacrifices. There's no Jews offering a Passover lamb or anything like that, but they do sit down and have their meal, their Passover meal. They try to observe it, but they can't biblically observe it because they don't even have their temple and they don't know who the Levites are. But yes, they do continue to try to observe those days, even today.
What is a good argument you can give somebody that's a Christian not to observe the Passover?
I would start right here with this passage right here. And you can bring in passages like 1 Corinthians 5 where he says Christ is our Passover. 1 Corinthians 5, I think it's verse 7. Christ is our Passover. He fulfilled what the Passover was pointing to. And of course, if you're talking to a Jew, that's hard to get across because they don't believe Jesus is the Christ. But that's the fundamental issue between us and the Jews, that whether or not Jesus is the Christ. They would say he was a phony or a fraud. He was not really the Christ, and you have to convince them that he was. Beyond that, I don't know what to tell you. You know, you show the difference between the old law and the new law, like we're doing here.
Armstrong that used to be on the radio years ago.
Herbert W. Armstrong, yeah.
And I had a cousin that listened to him and was raised in the church and everything. left the church and went and started meeting on Saturday and all that.
Yeah, he called it the Worldwide Church of God is what he called his group. But they believed in the Sabbath, that it was still in force, it was still binding.
But I don't think they meet on Saturday. They don't meet on Saturday, the Church of God.
Well, this is a different church. There's the Church of God. That's almost like a Pentecostal. And then there's the Worldwide Church of God, which is what he had. And those were not the same. They were not the same type of group. But I don't know if that Worldwide Church of God still exists. I assume it does, but he's long gone. He's died, but I don't know if the church still exists or not.
To Bowling Green to worship on Saturday. I don't worship, but that's
I
where
think
she
they're
used to
still
go.
there in Bowling Green, Johnny. I've got a cousin who goes.
Yeah, Kathy said she thinks they're still at that church. She's got a cousin that attends there, so they're still in existence. Yeah, he was big on the Sabbath. I used to listen to him on Sunday morning. He'd aggravate the time out of me, but I had to listen to him. I had to know what he was saying, and he was aggravating because he was really in on the Sabbath day. But this verse right here kind of knocks that in the head. You know, we're not supposed to do that. We're not supposed to observe days and months. And keep in mind, contextually, he's talking about the old law, but you can make an application today to holidays like Christmas and Easter because they're not even in the Bible at all, either Old or New Testament. And so you can kind of make an application. That's not really what he's talking about here. He's talking about the Jewish days, but you can make an application in principle to the same basic idea.
And there is a difference of someone observing a day individually or observing something as a religious right,
and enforcing it, binding it on others. You're right. It's one thing, and this is really helpful with the Jews because if you were a Jew, put yourself in their shoes for a minute, and in this day's that day especially, but you've just been converted to Christ. Now you've observed the Sabbath your whole life. You can't just turn that off. You know, you'd feel guilty going out and working on the Sabbath. So if you keep that to yourself, that's what you're saying. If you keep that to yourself, God don't care whether you work on Saturday or not. It doesn't matter to him. So if you keep that to yourself and observe it until you can learn better, until you can, you educate your conscience to it, then that's fine. You just can't bind it on other people. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I've mentioned this before, but it just never gets old with me to think. You hear some of the United States leaders or news and all this. Well, we got to protect Israel. That's God. The Jews is God's chosen.
Right.
Okay. So what does that mean to you? If you're not a Jew, does that mean that you're thinking to yourself, if you're not a Jew, what chance do you got?
Yeah. And there's actually two issues going on there. There might be some good reasons to be allied with Israel, but they're not biblical reasons, and that's what you're driving at. Yeah, that's what you're driving at. Yeah. Yeah.
The Bible. You better keep reading. Because you ain't got a chance.
Yeah. The people that they misunderstand, they were chosen, but they weren't chosen for salvation. They were chosen to be the people through whom the Messiah would come, and that's already happened. That's fulfilled. So they're not chosen any longer in that sense. But that's why they were chosen, not chosen for salvation. Salvation comes to all the same way through Jesus Christ, Jew or Gentile. It comes through Christ. Anything else? Yeah.
About the idols, it's hard for man to not want to see something and touch something.
Yeah.
They don't understand faith in Hebrews 11:1. Substance of things hoped for, evidence of things not seen.
Yeah.
We don't see God, but we see him all around us really too.
We see evidence of his work all around us, but we don't see him. And yeah, I think that's right. A lot of people, they need that tangible thing that you can see and lay your hands on. And that's why, just as an extension of that same point, the Roman Catholics will have these statues of Jesus. That's something they can see and touch and pray to. And they do that. But then they'll turn around and say, we don't worship that. Well, they'll say we venerate it, but we don't worship it. Well, look up the two words, veneration and worship. They mean the same thing. So they're just splitting hairs and making a distinction without a difference. But we don't worship the statue, we just venerate it. Well, that's actually the same thing. And if you're praying to something, that's worship. And even though it's a statue, so allegedly of Jesus, the Bible says we're not to make images of God because he's a spirit. So yeah, I think you make a good point there. And that the Catholic thing, that's just one example. There are others, they have to have tangible things to touch and see. And that slides into idolatry very quickly. And then there's other kinds of idols. We sometimes idolize our time. Money can become an idol to us. Sexual things can become an idol to us. So when something takes precedence over God, then it becomes your idol. It becomes the thing that you serve the most. Okay. All right, anything else before we move forward here? Okay, verse 12, I'm sorry. Brethren, I urge you to become like me, for I became like you. You've not injured me at all. Now, stop there for a second. Become like me. I left Judaism and I follow Christ. He said that way back in chapter 1. Remember that? He advanced in Judaism beyond many of his contemporaries. Let's see if I can find that in chapter 1, verse 14. I advanced in Judaism beyond my contemporaries, verse 15, but when it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb and called me through his grace to reveal his Son in me. So Paul is making the argument, I changed. I changed from one religion to another. So you need to become like me. You need to change. Give up on Moses, give up on Judaism, and make the change. Come on over here. For I became like you. Now, that harkens back to something we read in the 1 Corinthian letter when Paul said, I became all things to all men. Paul always tried to adapt wherever he was and be like them and fit in so that he could teach them the gospel. And he didn't try to force things that were of no value or of no consequence. He just taught the truth and tried to fit in with the people where he was. And then the last sentence there in verse 12, you've not injured me at all. Even though they questioned his apostleship, he's saying here, this isn't personal with me. I'm not offended. You haven't hurt me. I still love you. All I'm trying to do is teach you the truth. You've not offended me or injured me at all. In fact, I regard you very highly, verse 13. You know that because of physical infirmity, I preached the gospel to you at the first. Now, the first time he spoke to the Galatians, it was because of some physical infirmity. We don't know what that infirmity was. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. I just want to put that out there. Whatever that infirmity was, he had to stop there, and so he took the opportunity to preach to them. You know that because of physical infirmity, I preached to you. And my trial, which is the infirmity, which was in my flesh, whatever that was, it was some sickness, illness, disease, or something. My trial, which was in my flesh, you did not despise or reject, but you received me as an angel of God, even as Christ Jesus. So you treated me with respect. You have not injured me. I respect you, and I want you to come around here. I love you. So I'm not mad at you, even though some of you have questioned my apostleship. I'm not mad. You treated me well, and I'm good. You and I are good on a personal level. But I need you to get back to Christ here. Leave this law of Moses stuff behind and get back to Christ. But verse 15, what then was the blessing that you enjoyed? Now he's talking about spiritually here. What did you get when I preached the gospel to you? What did you get out of that? What was the blessing? And of course we know the answer to that. What blessing did they get out of hearing the gospel?
Salvation.
Yeah, they got salvation, remission of sins, hope of heaven. So what was that blessing? Don't think about that. Think about what you got here. For I bear you witness that if possible, you would have plucked out your own eyes and given them to me. Now, there's two ways to take that statement. They could just be, when you say you would pluck out your own eyes, what's the main point of that? The main point is kind of obvious.
Sacrifice.
Yeah, you would have made any sacrifice for me. Okay, you would have plucked out your own eyes, but who does that, And his point is, you would have made any great sacrifice for me. Having said that, I'll just throw this out here for your thought processes here. Some people think because of that statement and because of his thing about the physical infirmity, that the infirmity he speaks of was some kind of blindness or some kind of affliction in his eyes. Don't know that, can't prove that, but it kind of does fit a little bit. Because you would have plucked out your own eyes and given them. My eyes were shot. My eyes weren't working right. I'm having issues with my eyes, and that was the trial of my flesh, and you would have plucked out your own eyes and given them to me. The point is still the same, but I thought I'd throw that out there for you to think about. It doesn't prove conclusively that Paul's affliction was eyesight, but it is kind of thought-provoking, especially when you see things like later on. I think it might even be in this letter. You see with what large letters I have written to you. So he had to write great big when he wrote. Usually he had somebody else write for him, but when he wrote, he had to write great big letters so he could see them. And so he had some kind of affliction with his eyesight. In fact, remember when he saw Jesus, what happened to him? He was blinded, and then he was healed. But the healing, I don't know, again, just kind of speculating here, the healing might not have been a complete healing. He might have continued to have issues with his eyes. Again, these are all speculative things, but I think it's worth throwing in there. And you find this stuff in some of the commentaries. But I do want you to know that's not conclusive. That's just some interesting thoughts to throw out there. But the point is the same here, verse 15. You would have made great sacrifices for me. We had a good relationship, and as far as I'm concerned, we still have a good relationship. I just need to get you back to Christ and away from Moses. And so he's really concerned here. What he's doing in this section is expressing his personal concern for them, that he wants to see them go to heaven. He wants to see them be saved, and he's talking about their own personal relationships here. Verse 16, and that stands right on the heels of verse 15. You would have plucked out your own eyes and given them to me, but now things are different. Have I become your enemy because I tell you the truth? See, where they were, they would have plucked out your own eyes. Where they are now, we don't even know if Paul's an apostle. We're going back to Moses. We're going to circumcise our kids, and we're going to bind the law of Moses. So have I become your enemy because I'm telling you the truth? Why are you mad at me? What's going on here? You know me. You know I'm concerned about you. You know I've taught you the truth. So why are we at odds with each other? And what a powerful principle that is. Have I become your enemy because I tell you the truth? That happens, doesn't it, to all of us. We have family that'll turn on us. We have good friends that'll turn on us. Just as an aside, just as an illustration, I don't know if any of you have seen some of these videos that have gone out since the election. You know, they say, well, if your husband voted for Trump, you need to divorce him. Or if you've got a friend who voted for Trump, and so they become your enemy because of where you stand. And the same thing is being applied here. Because I told you the truth, you got mad at me over this? I told you the truth, and you got mad at me over this? What's going on here? And people get angry with us when we tell them the truth. You tell them they need to be baptized, they're ready to fight. You tell them there's only one church, they're ready to fight. And you suddenly become their enemy. And it shouldn't be that way. You know, we should be able to have a reasoned discussion, even if we end up disagreeing. We should be able to have a reasonable discussion with one another. And so that's a powerful principle there. Anything else up to this point? All right, now he's talking about, verse 17, these are the Judaizing teachers. These are the leaders of the opposition to Paul. Okay, they zealously court you. So you've got a tension going on. Paul's trying to pull them toward Christ, and the Judaizers, are trying to pull them toward Moses. And they're courting the Galatians. They zealously court you. Now, courting, that's figurative. When you're courting somebody, if you're a young man courting a woman, what are you trying to do? Win them over, that's right. And so that's what's going on here. The Judaizers are courting the Galatians, trying to win them over to their side of the argument. Paul's over there teaching the gospel, and we're over here teaching this Judaizing doctrine, and they're courting them. Come over our way. You know we're right. Circumcision has been in the law of Moses for hundreds of years, and so they're courting, see. They zealously court you, but for no good. No good's going to come out of this. If you listen to them, if you're persuaded by them, if you're pulled over by them, that's not going to do any good for you. Yes, they want to exclude you. There it is again. You've become our enemy because you don't see it like we do. So you're out. You could call this, they want to exclude you, you could call this withdrawing from the wrong people. They're excluding you. You can't be in our group. If you're going to side with Paul, you can't be in our group. So you got to make a decision. You want to be over here or you want to be with Paul? And so they were excluding, but they're excluding the wrong people. They should be including those. Those people are with the Lord, but they're wanting to exclude them. So they want to exclude you that you might be zealous for them. That was another means that they had of trying to pull them over to their side. They thought, well, if we just cut them out of our lives, they'll come around to our way of thinking. And of course, if you're serving the Lord, is that going to work? No. You know better. You're smarter than that. Yeah, it's just like politics. It's the same thing. That's what I was trying to say a while ago. Exactly right. Yeah, you're either with them or you're with us. And it puts pressure on people is what it does. And sometimes people make the wrong choices when that happens. They make the wrong choices. So, verse 18, but it's good to be zealous in a good thing. Now, you're not zealous in a good thing because they're trying to get you to exclude us, but being zealous is not bad in and of itself. It's what you're zealous for. So it's good to be zealous in a good thing always, and not only when I'm there. In other words, don't just be my buddy when I'm there and then stab me in the back when I'm gone. Okay. My little children. Now again, all this whole section, Paul's expressing his personal love for and concern for these. And right here, my little children. I consider you as though you were my own children. I came there, I taught you, I baptized you, I planted those churches in Galatia. You're just like my own children. My little children, for whom I labor in birth again until Christ is formed in you. I haven't given up on you. Even though some of you have given up on me, I haven't given up on you. But I have doubts, verse 20. I would like to be present with you and change my tone, for I have doubts about you. I'm not so sure. Are you going to stay with the Lord, or are you going to go back to Moses? I got doubts. At one time, I would have stood with you no matter what. But now that you're getting so wishy-washy, I got doubts. So I might change my tone of voice. Questions, comments? All right, but this whole section here that we were just looking at from verse 12 to verse 20, you see Paul's personal love for these people. That's really what he's pulling out of this. Now, starting in verse 21, we get to that great allegory of Hagar and Sarah. It gets a little complicated, so I prepared a chart up here that'll help us kind of walk through this thing. All right, let me read it, and then we'll back up here. Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not hear the law? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, the one by a bondwoman and the other by a free woman. But he who was of the bondwoman was born according to the flesh, he of the free woman through promise, which things are symbolic. The old King James says an allegory. Okay? For these are the two covenants, the one from Mount Sinai, which gives birth to bondage, which is Hagar. For this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to the Jerusalem which now is and is in bondage with her children. But the Jerusalem above is free, which is the mother of us all. For it is written, rejoice, O barren, you who do not bear. Break forth and shout, you who are not in labor. For the desolate has many more children than she who has a husband. Now we, brethren, as Isaac was, are children of promise. But as he who was born of the flesh persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, even so it is now. Nevertheless, what does the Scripture say? Cast out the bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be heir with the son of the free woman. So then, brethren, we are not children of the bondwoman, but of the free. And you're reading through that, and your eyes are going, whoa, there's a lot there. So I prepared a kind of a chart to walk us through this a little bit, okay? And so, Abraham had two sons. That's the title. And he starts off there, verse 21. You who desire to be under the law, you want to go back to the law of Moses, don't you hear the law? Let me tell you a little story from the law of Moses. For it is written that Abraham had two sons. So I'll put them up there, son number one and son number two. Now, if you want to get technical, Abraham had more than two sons. Because in Genesis 25, he had sons by Keturah. And so he had a bunch of sons, but we're interested in the two main sons. Abraham had two sons, and of course, we know the two sons were Ishmael and Isaac. And so let's kind of walk through this. Abraham had two sons, verse 22. One by a bondwoman, one by a free woman. Who was the bondwoman? Hagar. And he'll tell us that in just a second. And the free woman was Sarah, the mother of Isaac. So the one by the bondwoman, the other by the free woman. But he who was of the bondwoman was born according to the flesh, but he of the free woman through promise. Now, what promise is he talking about? Yeah, the Abrahamic promise. That comes up again and again and again. I told you that's the foundational promise of the Bible. That's the promise. This was born according to the flesh. They were trying to help God out. God told Abraham, I'm going to make you a father of many nations. Well, let me help you out. Here, have my handmaiden. You can have children by her. I'm barren. I can't have children. So here, have my handmaiden. That's how it played out. And so that was through the flesh. Okay. And then verse 24. These things are symbolic, okay, or an allegory. For these are the two covenants. See there? Covenant 1, covenant 2. Okay? Covenant 1 is the law of Moses. Covenant 2 is the gospel of Christ. You see the same thing in the Hebrew. The first covenant, the second covenant. Same idea. So these are the two covenants. Verse 24. For one, from Mount Sinai, which gives birth to bondage, which is Hagar. Now this gets complicated, so I'm going to spell it out for you here in just a second. This Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to the Jerusalem which now is and is in bondage with her children. So there it is. Verse 24. The one from Mount Sinai, okay? It gives birth to bondage, which is Hagar. See? That's that, and we're just following the thought right through the text. And is in bondage with her children. So what do we got over here? If this is covenant number 1, who's on this side? The Jews. Those are the children. She's in bondage with her children. Of course, the law of Moses was a yoke of bondage, which neither we or our fathers were able to bear. So she's in bondage with her children. But the Jerusalem which is above, oh, I forgot that last one. Verse 25. This Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. What happened at Mount Sinai? Ten Commandments, covenant number 1, that's right. This Hagar is Mount Sinai, correspondence to the Jerusalem which now is. That's physical Jerusalem here on the earth. The Jerusalem which now is. Okay, so I got ahead of myself. But the Jerusalem which is above, there's a lot implied, so I put it all up at once. The Jerusalem above, Mount Zion, Hebrews 12:22. You have come to Mount Zion, the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. Catch that. So here you have the physical Jerusalem, and over here you have the heavenly Jerusalem. That's the contrast. Mount Sinai, Mount Zion. Okay? And then one is in bondage, the other was free, the free woman, so it's free. And then verse 26, the Jerusalem above is free, not in bondage, and the mother of us all. Okay, so that's the Jerusalem above, the heavenly Jerusalem. So some of that is kind of implied. It's all there, but it's not necessarily stated. It's implied by way of contrast. You got Mount Sinai, that's where the law of Moses came from. Mount Zion, the heavenly Zion, where the law of Christ came from. Bondage over here, freedom, and what's the freedom from? Freedom from sin, the bondage of sin, that's right. And Hagar, and then Sarah is the mother of us all, because Abraham, all the nations of the earth would be blessed, see, through Sarah. And then the Jerusalem which now is and the Jerusalem above. So that's laid out here, what he said in these verses, so you can see it, okay? Verse 27, I'm looking at the clock here, make sure I got time to finish this. For it is written, rejoice, O barren, you who do not bear. Break forth and shout, you who are not in labor. For the desolate has many more children than she who has a household. Now this is a quote from Isaiah 54. And he's talking about Israel. But I want you to think about the application here in the context. In between these two women, which one was barren? Sarah was barren. Rejoice, Sarah, you barren one. The one who don't bear, you can't have children. Break forth and shout. Why? Because the desolate, Sarah, the barren one, has many more children. What kind of children does Sarah have? Not just Jews in the flesh, but also spiritual Israel, the Gentiles. So in the end, she winds up with a whole lot more children. If you be Christ, you're Abraham's seed, also Sarah's, and heirs according to the promise, spiritually. Questions, comments up to this point? Okay, so he quotes that Isaiah 54. He's making application to his little story here. Okay, verse 28, now he's going to clarify. Now we brethren, the Christians, Paul and the people at Galatia, we brethren, like Isaac was, are children of the promise. We belong over there, okay, under the new covenant. But as he who was born according to the flesh then persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, even so it is now. Going back to the original story of Isaac and Ishmael, and we can pick this up, hold your spot here, turn back to Genesis chapter 21. Genesis 21, verses 9 and 10. And here you are, put yourself in Sarah's shoes for a second. And Sarah got herself into this, by the way, because whose idea was it to give Hagar to Abraham to have a child with? That was her idea. And then she didn't like it. Once the chickens come home to roost, she didn't like it. So she's the one, it was her idea to give Sarah to Abraham. And Sarah, verse 9, saw the son of Hagar, that's Ishmael, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to him, scoffing. So there's the persecution that Paul speaks of. So Ishmael is scoffing at Isaac. Okay? Therefore, verse 10, she said to Abraham, cast out the bondwoman and her son. For this son of this bondwoman, Ishmael, the son of this bondwoman, Ishmael, shall not be heir with my son, namely Isaac. Okay? So that girl's got to go. It's interesting to me. She did that. She created that situation. Then she didn't like it. And she said, that woman's got to go. Well, you're the one that gave it to Abraham to start with. So this was your crazy idea. But that one's got to go. Now turn back to Galatians. He's making the parallel, the corollary. Verse 29. As he who was born according to the flesh, Ishmael, persecuted him, he scoffed at him, who was born according to the Spirit, he scoffed at Isaac. Even so it is now. The Jews are scoffing at the Christians. Okay? Nevertheless, what does the Scripture say? Don't you hear the law? Now watch my chart. Cast out the bondwoman and her son. Cast out the bondwoman and her son. Now can you see what Paul's point is? Put the old law away. Yeah, that's his point here. It's a big, long, drawn-out little illustration, but his point is we need to get rid of covenant number 1. We're not under that covenant. Cast out the bondwoman and her son. That's the whole point. And so I think when you put it up there like that, you can kind of walk through the text and see what's going on here. And he says in verse 31, so then, brethren, we are not children of the bondwoman. We're not of the first covenant. We're not of the law. We've moved beyond that, but of the free. We belong over here. We don't belong over here. We belong over there. Okay? This thing is gone. This thing is cast out. This old covenant is no longer in force. And that's the whole point he's making there. Even though it's long and complicated, that's the bottom line. Okay. Questions, comments?
So these Galatians, the Jews were trying to get them to, these Galatians that had become Christians.
Yeah.
The Jews were trying to get them, really, just trying to get them to come back to.
Yes, to Moses. Yeah, come back to the law of Moses.
Yeah.
And so you got in that church some Jews and some Gentiles. And the Jews are trying to get the Gentiles to come over here to Moses. Yeah. Yeah.
But the Galatians were never in the Jewish fold to begin with, right?
Well, some of them were. Some of them were Jews. This is a church that's made up of both Jews and Gentiles. Some of them were Jews, but they've left the law of Moses behind to become Christians. And now they're wanting to pick it up and then bind it on the Gentiles. And he says, no, can't do that.
It is so hard for anybody,
Yeah.
even today,
Yeah.
sometimes to come out of a denomination
Yeah.
without wanting to bring some of the things with it.
And that gets back to something Keith said earlier. Suppose today, making application of this today, suppose today we were to convert somebody from Herbert W. Armstrong's group who believes in the Sabbath. Suppose we were to convert a Seventh-day Adventist. For however long he's been a Seventh-day Adventist, he thinks he's got to keep the Sabbath. What would be wrong with him not working on Saturday? Nothing. Just as long as he doesn't try to bind that on you. And see, that's an application of what's going on right there. See, if you don't want to work on Saturday, that's fine. God doesn't care if you work on Saturday or not. You're not doing anything wrong. But you can't take that because it's written in the law of Moses and bind that on others. See? Same thing, exactly. God doesn't care if you're circumcised or not. But, so if you want to circumcise your children, go ahead. But you can't bind that on the others.
Some of the early Christians still kept the Sabbath.
Yeah.
I mean, still kept the Passover, still
Yeah.
observed some of those things, but they didn't, from indications Paul, they referred to some of those, but I don't think they wasn't binding it.
Right, they
and
weren't
saying
binding it on exactly.
that it was simple for you not to keep it,
Yeah.
and that,
Now,
I couldn't find it, but I think it's in Colossians, but there's a passage that talks of to not let them judge you in
food
Sabbath.
ordering, exactly, yeah.
I couldn't find it. I was trying to think, but how, make it, and I'm sure, I'm sure those Jewish people still followed a lot of those things for probably some time, but it'd be different when they bind it, saying, hey, you're sinning because you're not.
That's where they cross
You're not
the line.
doing it like this. You're
Exactly.
not keeping this. You
Yeah.
know?
And if we could see that, it would help a lot with even modern day things, like if you were to convert one of these people. Now, there's something to add to that. There's an expectation of these converts to eventually grow up, okay? And I'm not saying you have to put a time limit on it, but at some point they got to learn, I don't really have to keep the Sabbath. They got to learn that, but it's hard to get somebody, they've been done that their whole life. You can't just turn that off like flipping a switch. You know that feeling. Because I've been taught since I was that high. I can't work on Saturday. You can't just turn that off. It's going to take you a while for that to sink in. And so go ahead, stay home on Saturday. Don't work on Saturday if you want to. Just don't enforce it on the others. And then we can have peace and move on, move forward. But when you start making it a salvation issue, you must do what we do. Then we got problems because you're binding the law of Moses on the others. And you don't have the right to do that.
You can add a couple items to your chart there.
Okay.
No salvation under the law of Moses.
Right.
Salvation under Christ only.
Yes. In fact, you're exactly right. That's what's implied in the bondage and the free. You're in bondage. If you're over here, you're still in bondage to your sin because the blood of bulls and goats can't take away sin. Over here, you're free from your sin, free from the law of Moses. And so, yeah, it's implied. You're exactly right, though. That's a great point. Yes.
In the last part of verse 27 saying that the descendants of Ishmael will be more than Isaac.
Well, it's spiritual descendants. It is, yes, but it's spiritual descendants. It's the church. He's talking about the church. He's talking about Jew and Gentile. All the nations. There, back there in chapter 3 and verse 29, if you're Christ, you're Abraham's seed. Whether you're a Jew or Gentile, you're his seed. Not literal descendant, but his spiritual family. Does that make sense? Are you hearing what I'm saying? Or you look confused?
Yeah, I don't know, it's just odd that it mattered the quantity.
Yeah.
Are Christians?
He's not saying there's going to be more Jewish people. He's saying there's going to be more believers. The children, huh? Well, more believers than those who follow Judaism. He's comparing the two religions, not the whole world, but comparing the two religions. Yeah. The children, the desolate has many more children. Sarah has many more children, spiritually, Christians, than she who has a husband. And so this side versus this side. I don't know if I made it worse or not. Yeah. Okay.
Does Hagar have a husband?
Well, she didn't have a husband per se, but it was his, what they call it, a concubine. She became Abraham's concubine. So he had a relation with her, and at his own wife's bequest, because she was barren. I can't have kids, so here, take my handmaid and have kids by her. And so she became his concubine.
But I understand all that, but the way this is written, it makes it sound like the one that has a husband, which would be Sarah, would be the one that...
You're right, and in that context, the husband would be Abraham. But it wasn't really a husband per se. I don't think they actually got married, but it was a concubine. That's almost like a husband. They were, it's not quite the same. It's hard for us to relate to the whole concubine thing because we don't do that today. But it's almost like a wife.
I understand that, but in this last sentence, it says, then she who has a husband, that would be Sarah, because she's the one that has a husband, not Hagar.
Well, it's talking about Hagar. I know what you're saying. She actually has a husband, but her husband in this context, and I'm using the word in quotation, her husband here is Abraham. And that was the concubine relationship is that he's referring to there, but he is using the word husband. And another thing, by the way, if I can just confuse it some more, the word husband and the word man come from the same Greek word. So then she who has a man, it could be translated that way. Her concubine man, if I can use that word, her relationship with that man, or that, instead of husband. I don't know if that helps or makes it worse, but I thought I'd throw, okay, thanks. Huh?
Is it Sarah the desolate?
She's the desolate. She's desolate because she was barren. That's why she was desolate. But she ends up having more because she had, not only did God open her womb and she had all the Jews, but then down the road she gets all the Christians too. They become part of the family of Abraham, spiritually speaking. Yeah. All right.
Some of these other countries will wipe out the Jews. Is it because?
It goes back to the Muslim thing. A lot of it does, and they're fighting because Ishmael was actually the firstborn. So the firstborn was supposed to get all the inheritance rights. See, but God did it differently, as God so often does. And He said, no, it's not going to be Ishmael. It's going to be an Isaac. And so that's the genesis of that whole fight. And today, over the course of time, those people have become the Muslim people. You know, the Arabs. And so, yeah, they hate the Jews with a passion over that land. It's all about that land. And I've gone way over time. I need to hush. Sorry.